driving for Uber for about 3 years now. It's not my main gig, but it's decent money and it lets me meet all kinds of people. Usually it's pretty chill. Airport runs, drunk people on weekends, that sort of thing. But one night, about a month ago, something happened that I can't stop thinking about. I still don't know if I made the right call, and honestly, I probably never will. It was a Thursday night, nothing special. I'd been driving since around 5 p.m, mostly picking up people from bars and restaurants. The app had been quiet for about 20 minutes when a new request came in. A pickup in a residential neighborhood about 10 minutes away. The name on the app just said Joe. No profile picture, nothing. I almost didn't take it because the rating was low, like 4.2 or something. That's usually a red flag. But it was late and I figured it would be a quick ride, so I accepted. The house was at the end of a dead-end street, one of those older neighborhoods where the streetlights barely work. The house looked run-down too. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn, a couple of rusted-out cars in the driveway. When I pulled up, there was no one outside. I double-checked the address on the app and thinking maybe I'd gotten it wrong, but it matched. I waited for a couple of minutes, then sent a quick "I'm here" message through the app. Almost immediately the front door opened and the guy came out. He looked off. I don't know how else to describe it. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, even though it wasn't cold out, and he kept his head down as he walked to the car. "Hey, are you Joe?" I asked as he climbed into the back seat. "Yeah," he said, barely looking up. His voice was low and raspy, like he'd been shouting all day or something. He didn't smell like booze, but there was this weird metallic smell that I couldn't place. I almost asked about it, but something about him made me decide not to. He gave me an address about 15 miles away, out in the direction of the industrial part of town. I punched it into the GPS and we started driving. At first, it was quiet. Most people either chat or stare at their phones, but Joe just sat there, staring out the window. After a few minutes, I tried making small talk. "So, heading to work?" I asked. "No," he said flatly. No follow-up, nothing. Just no. I didn't push it. Sometimes people just don't want to talk, and that's fine. But the longer we drove, the more uneasy I started to feel. He kept shifting in his seat like he couldn't get comfortable. And every now and then I'd catch him glancing at me in the rearview mirror. Not in a friendly passenger kind of way either. It was more calculating. About 10 minutes into the ride, the GPS told me to take a left onto this smaller road. It wasn't totally rural, but it was definitely less populated. More warehouses, fewer streetlights. "Hey, you sure this is the right way?" I asked just to make sure. "Yeah," Joe said. "Just follow the GPS." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His tone wasn't irritated or impatient, it was more like final, like he already knew where he was going and it didn't really matter what I did. The road got darker as we went. The buildings were spaced farther apart and a lot of them looked abandoned. There were no other cars and the only light came from my headlights. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. Joe was still staring out the window, but his hands were fidgeting in his lap like he was working himself up to something. My mind started racing. Was this guy planning to rob me? Carjack me? I'd hear stories about Uber drivers getting attacked, and I suddenly felt very aware of how alone we were out there. Finally, the GPS announced we'd arrived. The address was for a large, fenced-up building with no lights on. It looked completely deserted. "This is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," Joe said, but he didn't move to get out of the car. He just sat there for a moment, breathing heavily. Then he leaned forward and said, "Can you wait here a minute? I'll pay extra if you stay." I didn't like it, but I nodded. "Sure," I said, though every part of me screaming to just drive away. Joe got out of the car and walked toward the building, disappearing into the shadows. I locked the doors as soon as he was out of sight. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I kept glancing around, half expecting someone to come out of the darkness. My mind was running wild. What was Joe doing in there? Why did he need me to wait? Was he meeting someone? I was about 2 seconds away from leaving when I saw him come back. He was walking fast, almost running, and his hands were empty. He jumped into the back seat and said, "Go now." "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just drive," he snapped. His voice was shaking now, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to follow us. I didn't ask any more questions. I just focused on getting back to the main road. The whole time Joe was fidgeting in the back seat, muttering to himself under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. When we finally got back to his neighborhood, Joe told me to drop him off a few blocks away from where I'd pick him up. He handed me a $20 bill as he got out, muttered a quick thanks, and disappeared down an alley. I sat there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that he was just some weird guy with a lot on his mind. But something about the whole thing felt wrong. The next morning, I woke up to a bunch of notifications on my phone. The local news was reporting that police had found a body in the industrial area, the same area where I'd dropped Joe off. The victim was a man in his 40s, and the details were brutal. I don't know if Joe was involved. I don't even know if I want to know. But ever since that night, I've been second-guessing every ride I take. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe I drove someone away from a crime scene. Either way, I don't think I'll ever forget the way he looked at me in the rearview mirror. Alright, so I don't even know where to begin with this. I'm still kind of shaking just writing it out, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. This happened a few months ago, and it still creeps me out every time I think about it. I swear this is 100% real, and I hope by sharing it, maybe someone else can avoid similar situations. I was visiting a friend who lives a couple of hours away from me. I don't drive, so I usually take an Uber for longer trips like this. It's a little pricey, but it's just more convenient. Anyway, the night this happened, my friend and I had been out pretty late. We were catching up, having drinks, and I ended up staying later than I planned. Around 1 a.m., I decided it was time to head back home. My friend offered to let me crash on his couch, but I had work in the morning and just wanted to get back to my place. I pulled up the Uber app and booked the ride. A few minutes later, I got a ping saying my driver was on the way. This guy's name was David, and the car was a grey Honda Accord. When the car pulled up, everything seemed normal. It matched the description on the app, and the driver rolled down the window, smiled, and said, "You're my ride, right?" I nodded, got in, and we started driving. For the first 10 minutes or so, it was fine. He was polite, we made small talk about the weather and how late it was. But then something weird happened. He missed a turn. I politely pointed it out, like, "Hey, I think you were supposed to turn back there." He kind of chuckled and said, "Oh, don't worry, I know a shortcut." Now, I'm not super familiar with the area, but it didn't look like we were going the right way. The streets got quieter, darker, and there were fewer and fewer houses. I asked him again if he was sure we were going the right way, and his tone changed. He got a little defensive and said, "Yeah, I know what I'm doing, relax." That threw me off because he'd been so friendly before. I started getting this weird feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right. I pulled out my phone to check the Uber app, and I noticed the ride wasn't showing up anymore. You know how it usually shows the little map with your location? It was gone, just a blank screen. I thought it was a glitch, so I tried refreshing it, but it didn't come back. At that point, I started to panic a little. I asked him again, "Hey, are you sure we're going the right way? Because this doesn't look familiar at all." He didn't answer me. He just kept driving, and I could see his hands gripping the wheel real tight. I kept my phone out and opened Google Maps to try to see where we were. That's when I realized we were driving in the complete opposite direction of my house. I said, "Look, I don't know where you're taking me, but this isn't right. I need you to turn around and take me home." He still didn't respond. He just kept driving. I started freaking out at this point. I told him I was calling the police if he didn't stop the car, and that's when he finally spoke to me again. He said, "You're not calling anyone." His voice was so cold and flat it sent chills down my spine. I didn't even think. I just hit the button to call 911. The second I did that, he reached over and tried to grab my phone. I yanked it away and started yelling at the top of my lungs, hoping someone, anyone would hear me. That's when he pulled the car over on the dirt road in the middle of nowhere. He turned off the engine, turned to me and said, "Get out." I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. He reached into the glove compartment and I thought he was grabbing a weapon, but instead he pulled out a second phone. He started typing something on it and I used that moment to throw the door open and run. I don't know where I was going. It was pitch black and I couldn't see anything, but I just kept running. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I came across a small house with the lights still on. I banged on the door like I was a madman, screaming for help. An older man opened the door and I just blurted out everything, begging him to let me in. Thankfully, he did. He called the cops for me while I sat there shaking and trying to catch my breath. When the police arrived, they searched the area but didn't find the guy or the car. They took my statement and said they'd investigate, but I never heard back from them. Here's the part that really messes with me. When I checked my Uber app later, the ride was gone. It was like it never happened. No record of the driver, no trip history, nothing. I don't know who that guy was or what he was planning, but I'm just grateful I got away. I still take Ubers sometimes, but I'm way more cautious now. I always check the driver's face and the license plate, and I share my ride details with a friend. If you ever feel like something's off, trust your gut. It might just save your life.